So yes, that's me, Rachel Andrew. This is my second time at CSSconf EU. I've done a few CSSconfs around the world now. Really great to be here. Berlin is very much my favorite city, so I take any chance to come here. So I'm going to talk, it's a non-technical talk, which is unusual for me. My sort of comfort zone is to have 150 slides of code. So I've had to write a non-technical talk, and I'm going to talk about where CSS comes from. And if we wanted to be literal about this, it comes from 1996, because that's when the CSS1 specification was published. And in the same year, we got IE3. And that was the first browser which had some CSS support. And very neatly, my career as a web developer started in 1996. I am one of those people who had to install her web browsers from CDs that were sent by the ISP. Don't know if anybody else can remember doing that. Anyone else? Anyone else is old? There's a few of you. We can all get together and remember the good old days later. So I've been working on the web for a long time, and so my history as a web developer sort of has gone along with CSS. I started to build websites without CSS because it wasn't a reality that I had version 2 browsers. There was no option other than font tags and nested tables. That was just how things were done. And the really amazing thing about CSS, and I don't think we talk about this enough, is the fact that all of those early things we built, and as we started to use CSS, and as we started to use CSS for layout, all that stuff really still works. CSS remains backwards compatible, and that's really important. And therein lies a lot of the problems that we actually have with CSS in terms of creating CSS and using CSS, is this, we can't go around breaking the web. So I'm not really going to talk about the history of CSS today. That stuff's pretty well documented. What I really want to talk about is, where does CSS come from today? Where does new CSS come from? What's the process? How do we go from an idea to something that ends up in a browser? Because I hear all kinds of strange theories and kind of like weird conspiracy theories about where CSS comes from. And I think some of that actually does have its roots back in the olden days, back in the days when I became a member of the Web Standards Project. Because browser vendors were competing at one point on platform features. So they were bringing out new CSS features and saying, well, we've got this. We've got this, and Netscape hasn't got it. And ultimately, we were building, if you wanted to do cool new stuff, you'd build 2 websites. You'd build one for Internet Explorer, one for Netscape. You'd detect which browser the user had, and you'd send them to the right website. And this was terrible. And people who didn't want to do that would put best viewed with buttons on their web pages. That's horrible. And people kind of expect that browser vendors are locked in some battle about CSS. And actually, what really happens looks a bit like this. This I took at the CSS Working Group meeting in Tokyo a couple of weeks ago. We were all locked in that room. No one was allowed to go for coffee until we decided what happens to line height when you've got 2 fonts of different character sets next to each other. Now, just in that photo, there are people from Microsoft, Google, Mozilla, and several other companies, and they're all working together on a particular CSS issue. And you can have a look at the current members of the CSS Working Group. It's a whole bunch of people making CSS, representing lots of different browser vendors and other people. There's lots of people there who work on things like ebooks, EPUB, and outputting CSS to print. So you can have a look at their affiliations, the people who are there. So any CSS specification passes through this group. We get the opportunity to debate parts of the spec and vote on changing or adding features. And that really stops one vendor or one party dragging a specification away from what would benefit the web as a whole. And these specs have to start somewhere. So they come from all sorts of places. They often do come from a particular browser vendor in order to solve problems that that vendor thinks are important. So they may be kind of problems they see in their business. But it's not just browser vendors. The CSS Shapes spec started life with Adobe. And others come directly from the working group because they're going to solve some problem that we see, or we know we need a way to do a certain type of thing to enable something else. And so those specs might come directly from the working group. So I wanted to take a look at this process, and I thought I'd do that via CSS Grid, because if you know me, you'll know that I'm a bit of a Grid superfan, and I've been working with the spec for quite a long time, and so I kind of know the history of this specification. So well, let's talk about CSS specs via Grid, and what happened to that, and how it became something that we could use in browsers. So how did that start out? Quite a long time ago. It's 2011, we got a first public working draft. Now, if you go and have a look at that document, you'll find that a lot of the concepts there seem pretty familiar if you've used modern grid layout. See, an awful lot of the features that you use are kind of outlined in that spec. They might have different names or look a bit different, and things are a little bit vague around the edges, but it's kind of all there. So 6 years before it made it into our browsers, we had this first draft. And in fact, it goes back a long way. The ideas in Grid go back to around 2005. This is the CSS Advanced Layout module. It looks very like some of the stuff that's in the Grid spec. The Grid template areas, ASCII art syntax, pretty much described in this spec. And that's often the case with working group things. You get these notes, these collections of ideas that may well become something that we have in CSS, but might just kind of float around. Just like when you're developing any product, you kind of have these ideas, and you think, oh yeah, that would be really cool, maybe we should think about implementing that, and it gets kind of put on the back burner. That happens with CSS as well. So, a working draft. Now, a working draft is essentially a snapshot of the state of the spec at a particular date, and it means we can reference it. It means I can write about it and say, oh, you know, on this date, this working draft, this is the names of the properties. It's useful to have a reference of the state of the spec. Now, publication of a working draft doesn't mean a lot in terms of implementation. It doesn't mean the spec's mature, it might not be finished, it might have great big holes in it. It's just a snapshot of where the work was on that day. If you want to see where the work actually is today, you want to look for the editor's draft, and they're always linked from the working draft. Now that's what the spec editors are actually working on right now, so that will be the most up-to-date thing, but could be completely different to the working draft and any experimental implementations. It's, you know, where all the bug fixes are going. And if you take a look at that first public working draft, you'll see the editors listed. And those spec editors were from Microsoft. So the initial Grid spec came from Microsoft. So you have them to thank for the fact we have Grid at all. In addition to drafting this first version of the spec, they created an experimental implementation in IE10. So Grid is in IE10 and up. It's MS prefixed because that's how experiments were released in those days. So in general, as specs are developed, if they've come from a browser event, there's going to be some experimental implementation that they've done. Back in the day, it was with vendor prefixes. Now they tend to be behind flags. And these give you the chance to play around with new CSS, which is really important. And I'll come back to that in a bit. So the experimental implementations let the vendors, the browser vendor, and also the working group know whether this is something that people are interested in, and to start to look at the problems that might be in that spec. And it was where my journey with grid layout began, with this experimental IE implementation. IE10 implemented quite a lot of the features in the spec, not everything, but it was enough to make me realize that this was something that we wanted. And what I also knew, through having followed CSS for such a long time, was that new stuff often needs someone to promote it. It needs superfans. It needs someone to go out there and talk to other web developers and say, look at this cool thing, because through that, the interest is gauged, and that we kind of actually get this stuff into all of our browsers. So I thought, well, I'm going to start talking about this. I'm going to start telling people about this spec and use what I knew about teaching CSS. So I've been teaching basic CSS since about 2001. So I'll take what I knew about that and apply it to this thing that was experimental and start talking about it. And while I was doing this, the spec moved on. And for quite a while, I was standing on stage talking about something which didn't have a browser implementation, because the spec was different to what was in IE10, but we didn't have any new implementations. Thankfully, that didn't last too long, because it was kind of hard making up how this stuff might work. And we started to get an implementation in Blink and WebKit, which is done by a company called Igalia, and actually sponsored by Bloomberg. And here's a little bit of CSSconf history. Because the first time I met the people from Igalia doing that implementation, and also some from Bloomberg, was here at CSSconf in 2014, where I was talking about CSS grid layout. And I was actually pretty nervous once I realized they were all here, because I was going to be talking about the work that they were doing, and they were going to be in the room. So that was fairly scary, but it was very nice. It was great to meet them, and we sort of chat back and forth on Twitter now and things, and I've been in touch with them ever since. I think it's also interesting that Bloomberg sponsored the development of CSS Grid in Blink and WebKit. So they wanted the feature. They wanted it for the embedded Chromium that's inside their terminal product. So they wanted that platform feature. And by sponsoring it as an open web feature, we all get it, and they get what they need for their business. And that's very interesting. And Bloomberg have actually sponsored quite a lot of features in CSS and JavaScript to be implemented into browsers. So by this point, we had sort of implementations, and we were starting to work with those. And I was presenting about Grid and talking to web developers, people like at CSSconf, and something came up over and over again. And it was this. There was no way to create a gap between tracks in the grid. And people immediately looked at Grid and said, well, it's a bit like multi-column layout. Why don't we have something like column gap in Grid? Now, in the IE implementation, it was kind of a bit annoying, but it didn't really matter too much that you didn't have gutters. What you could do was define little skinny tracks in your grid and use those as gutters, because you had to place everything explicitly on the grid. But the new specification had this idea of auto-placement. So you could define a grid and then throw a bunch of content at it, and Grid would just auto-place it. So a bit like with Flexbox, where things place one after the other. With no gutters, you couldn't use auto-placement, because Grid would try and place items into those skinny tracks. So that wasn't ideal. So I was talking about this on stage and saying, this isn't great. Web developers are talking about this and saying we need to have some kind of gap between our tracks, which led me to discussing the issue with people from the working group. And one of the spec authors, she wrote the feature into the spec, where it was implemented and became part of the level 1 spec, which meant that a bit of code like this, with those 10-pixel gutter tracks, could be simplified and would end up looking like this. And the thing about this is, that was just one thing that kind of went into the spec that I remember and I was kind of part of. But the important thing about that is that that was feedback from the web community making its way into a CSS specification. Because we were playing with an experimental spec, we were able to make changes to that spec. And at the time, I wasn't a working group member. I've only been a working group member for about a year. So I wasn't a working group member, and I was just talking to other web developers, but we were able to make a change to the level 1 spec. We can do this with any new bits of the platform that we're interested in. So we've got a spec that's kind of in this state, and it's changing, and it's becoming different as it's moving along, and browsers are implementing at the same time. So we've kind of got a spec, and we've got browser development, and things are changing in the spec, and the browsers are having to make changes because of that. And that's kind of how a lot of things happen, in this kind of circular way, where we get an implementation and we get the spec developing alongside each other. It's certainly not a case that the working group sort of hide in a room, develop a specification, throw it at browser vendors and say, well, there you go, good luck with that. This thing happens in a circular way. And this iterative development has happened for a very long time with specifications, but as many people know, this is bitterness in the past. If you tried to use early Flexbox, for example, in a production site, and it was vendor prefix, you could use it in a production site, you might have a site working, and then a new browser came out with a different implementation of Flexbox. And at one point, there were kind of 3 different implementations of Flexbox out there in the wild. Now, grid has changed even more than the Flexbox spec did, but it did so behind a feature flag in browsers, which meant that no one could use it for production code. So we didn't have this issue of it kind of being out there and biting people as the spec changed. So that's really the difference between developing with vendor prefixes, which has really gone away, and developing with feature flags. It's enabled the spec to change and to have this iterative process of browser development and spec development without that then sort of getting into our sites and causing us problems. So it took till 2016 for the working group to essentially say, we think this is probably done. That's quite a long time. It's a very, very big spec. So when the working group thinks something is pretty much done, it's voted to become a candidate recommendation. And what that means is the spec has moved on from being a working draft, and the working group thinks this is time it needs to have implementation experience. We think this spec can be implemented. We think it's useful. We think it does the things it set out to do. Do we have implementation experience? So have vendors implemented everything? And the next step will be a proposed recommendation. So this is like saying, well, this is what we think is going to be the spec. And we need to have 2 independent, interoperable implementation of all of the features. So that means that we need to have 2 browsers, really, that have implemented the features. And not only do we need to have 2 browsers, the work needs to have been done by 2 different people or groups of people. So the work done by Igalia, say in WebKit and Blink, that wouldn't really count as 2 implementations. They're different browsers. It's actually pretty much the same code, because I think ground was broken on that before the project's forked. But it's the same company doing that work. But we've also got the work in Firefox. So because we've got the work in Firefox done by a different team, we've got 2 implementations. And so hopefully, Grid will be able to progress. Once all of the little bugs have been worked out and all of the features are implemented, Grid will be able to progress on. And the reason we have this requirement is it makes sure that we don't have things that are W3C recommendations that are only implemented in one browser, or perhaps could only be implemented in one browser because of the way that browser worked. Something you might see in the spec, if you look at the current working draft, you'll see that something called subgrid is marked as at risk in the spec. And what this means, actually, in the current editor's draft, subgrid has been removed. It's been pushed to level 2. And this at-risk flag, what it means really is this is a feature that we think might not be able to be implemented by 2 implementations. It might not be in a state that we can actually get that and move the spec on in a timely manner. So we flag it as at risk. That doesn't mean that the thing will never be implemented. And in fact, subgrid was discussed at the last working group meeting. We had a sort of breakout session on it. It's still very much on the cards. But it's been moved into level 2 of the spec rather than dropped. So it essentially moved into a different release of that bit of CSS. Just like you might decide that a certain feature of your product is going to get bumped into another release so that you can ship the stuff that you've been working on. CSS works pretty much in the same way. So, March 2017, we got Grid in all of these browsers, and Edge have also announced that they're going to be updating too. So it took a very long time. It took almost 6 years to get Grid into browsers. So why on earth does CSS take so long? And it's partly because there's a lot of stakeholders. It needs to be implemented in browsers in a way that's not going to cause problems, or performance problems, accessibility issues. And behind every browser is a business, and they're going to have different priorities. They need to be able to schedule a team to work on something to get that implementation in the browser. So we got Grid because Microsoft thought it was interesting to start with, and then Bloomberg were willing to fund it into other browsers. There's also us, authors, the people who write CSS. CSS has to make as much sense as possible to web developers, because if something is just too complicated or crazy looking, well, people might not implement it, they might not use it, and then there's no point having that CSS at all. Introducing this talk, I mentioned how amazing it was that CSS doesn't break things, it's backwards compatible. This is really, really important. And it'll come as no surprise to people in this room that some of CSS is a bit suboptimal. So behold the list of things that we're going to fix in CSS just as soon as someone has invented a time machine. So, if it seems that some CSS is really, really weird, doing a bit of digging might just turn up why it's so weird, which at least will confirm that the CSS Working Group aren't just trying to make your life hard, but also by understanding why things seem really weird. It can help you understand and remember that. You know, it may be because it was added a long time ago and we didn't know the web was going to be like this. And it may be because they're new, but they have to cope with something added a long time ago when we didn't know the web was going to be like this. And sometimes they're weird because they're dealing with stuff that you don't run into. There's some stuff that's weird because it has to cope with languages that run right to left and top to bottom as well as left to right. There's lots and lots of stuff in CSS which is dealing with that kind of issue. So trying to figure out why things seem odd can just help you remember them. But what is really important is that you can help to influence the direction of CSS far more than you imagine that you can. And you can do this in a whole bunch of ways that I'm going to cover now, because I really, as someone who is just a web developer, you know, running a tiny company, I'm not from a big browser vendor, and I'm on the working group. And the thing that I like to do is take people's feedback to the working group, take other web developers' feedback and bring it to the working group. So here's the way everyone can be doing that. One of the simplest ways to get involved is to go to browsers and ask for features to be implemented. A lot of browsers have got official ways of doing this. Go and use it, vote for stuff, post stuff up, tell browsers that you want stuff. But even more important is to start using things, especially if that stuff only exists in one browser at the moment. Browser vendors are tracking usage of features to see what the demand is for the feature. So here you can see the usage of Flex. This is on Chrome status. They're tracking to see how often this stuff is used. Microsoft have got a similar data gathering effort. If you use a feature in production, even if it's just on your personal site, and even if you have to do a fallback for other browsers, that is noted. And it's like, oh, well, people are wanting this because they're using it. For things that are tucked away behind browser flags, using them in production is impossible. But another way to show interest is if you write or talk about this stuff. Write posts on your blogs. You know, talk about the thing. Do presentations at meetups or whatever. This photo is a screenshot from Event Part in Seattle, which is when Edge announced they were going to update their grid implementation. They responded on stage to an email I sent them in 2014, chasing them up about updating their IE10 implementation. Browser vendors are listening. They want to know what we want, make sure that they get that message. And it's not just about speaking to browser vendors. You can actually take part in developing CSS itself. You know, you don't need to be a special person. You don't need to be an invited expert to the CSS Working Group to get involved. Because we need designers and developers to take a look at new stuff, to make suggestions about things that we haven't solved yet in CSS. Everything that happens at the CSS Working Group happens in the open. So you can follow along with what's happening and you can, make your own comments. The specifications and issues raised against them are held in GitHub in the CSS Working Group drafts repository. So you can go and you can have a look at that and you can see what issues have already been raised. You can comment on them. You can raise some of your own. The CSS Working Group are on Twitter, and things are posted there that we're working on, and also sometimes direct questions are posted there, quite often about naming. What should we call this property, because we don't know, and we're asking for feedback. You can also see all of the current work of the CSS Working Group, so you can see if there's something that you think you'd like to comment on. Feature requests for CSS. You can request those in very much the same way you'd ask for any feature of a product. And the best way to do that is to come up with a sort of use case, as opposed to proposing syntax. Actually, the syntax of CSS is very, very hard to kind of work out because it has to cope with all this old stuff and legacy stuff. And quite often we go round and round on names quite a few times before it's decided what it's going to be. But the use case is the important thing. What problem are you trying to solve with this CSS? And are authors already working around this in some way? A lot of the time, people are doing things in JavaScript. That would make a lot of sense to be able to do in CSS. Well, if we've got that JavaScript implementation, then that's a really good test case for, well, how do we actually do this in native CSS? So that's really useful. And if using JavaScript to do things isn't a bad thing, but are there problems because of that use of JavaScript? Is it creating a performance issue that perhaps we could solve if it was part of CSS? So that sort of stuff, if you can bring that into an issue on GitHub, people are going to look at that and they're going to talk about it. And we bring up these things in working group meetings and talk about them and try and see if there is a way that they could be solved. So as an example, you can go and have a look at, one of the things that happens, people start to look at CSS grid, and they say, oh, well, can I just style the backgrounds of grid areas? Can I style column tracks? Can I add borders to them? And the answer at the moment is no, you have to put an element in there to style them. It's kind of creating containers for elements. So we need some kind of grid cell pseudo element in order that you can style the backgrounds and borders. That's something that a lot of people have asked for. So it's something that has been put in as an issue, and quite a lot of people have commented on that thread. If it's something you're interested in, you can always go and read and see if you've got anything else to share. So this is how new CSS is happening. People are asking for things, and we're talking about them and trying to work out the best way of doing that. So that will probably be a level 2 feature. You can see it's got a CSS Grid 2 flag tag on it, so that we can sort of keep track on it as we start to look at the level 2 of CSS Grid layout. Now, it's not just about new features. There are bugs in specifications. CSS specs that can be very long and complex, and they can end up with bugs in. If you spot something that's an issue, come and raise it. If it turns out it's not an issue, it might just be that we need to clarify that bit of the spec because someone thinks that what's said in the spec is actually wrong. So that's actually a bug as well, because we want the specs to be clear. So come and log issues against the specs. And web browsers, they'll be very happy to hear about your interop issues too. You can go and you can log bugs in any browser. If you find something that is not working in a browser, go and tell them about it, because quite often it's when people get their hands on new CSS, they start using it with some other CSS, they start using it with some JavaScript or in conjunction with a framework, and that shows up bugs that no one spotted before. If you find them, go and log them. That helps everybody. And you learn this great thing when you log bugs. You learn how to make reduced test cases, which I believe is a web development superpower, and not enough people are good enough at doing this. It makes your life a lot easier if you learn how to make a reduced test case, not just for logging bugs, but also fixing problems in your own work. Getting good at stripping down problems, the simplest case, really makes everything that you do an awful lot easier, and it will help other people to reproduce your bug and to fix it quickly. So the thing is, what I've found is that contributing to CSS has been an amazing way to learn about CSS. What I've learned in the last few years following the grid spec and ultimately becoming part of the CSS Working Group has been absolutely amazing. And I've been doing this for 20 years, and I feel like I have learned so much. I contribute to CSS. I spend a lot of time doing free work, essentially for the web platform. But I think we're pretty much even, because it gives me so much back in terms of what I've learned as I've done that. What I've learned by raising an issue and then having all of the implications of that explained to me. I couldn't have got that anywhere else. So I've learned so much by contributing to CSS. It's been very, very much worth it. And so really, to answer that question, where does CSS come from? Where does modern CSS come from? There's absolutely no reason why the next amazing feature can't come from any one of the people sat in this room today. In very real ways, CSS comes from people like you and me. So be part of it, because it is great fun. Thank you very much for listening. You'll find lots of resources at that link there, and you can find me all over the web. And I love talking about this stuff, so please do come and have a chat to me. Thank you.
All right. Ah, that's so good.